Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a historical edition of Cabin Crafts. And today I'm in my cage bar because today is the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, one of my very favorite events that I loved to learn about when I was a kid. And it's actually very, very special. I mean, a lot of times in school, kids would just learn, oh, well, they threw a bunch of tea in the harbor and, that's pretty much it. They dressed up as Indians and blah, blah, blah. But it was much more complicated than that. And so on December the 16th at midnight, 1773, 250 years ago, was the Boston Tea Party. And so I wanted to talk about that today because it's so important. It was one of the largest sparks that sparked the American Revolution, the Tea Party. And here's why. So our leader is Samuel Adams. He is the cousin of John Adams, and he is the head of the Sons of Liberty. Now, the Sons of Liberty were a secret organization in Boston at the time that they wanted to overthrow the tyrannical rules of the British government. Now, they weren't necessarily trying to overthrow the government at that time, but after the French and Indian War, which in Europe they call it the 7 Years' War, which was in the 1760s. Great Britain had gone to war with France over control of the American continent. And Great Britain won, but it drained their resources and money. So they needed money to pay back their treasury, their war chest. And so they thought, well, we will tax the colonies. So they, in 1765, for instance, they had the Stamp Act, and that taxed paper and paint and lead and playing cards, any diplomas from universities, anything that was made of paper. They had several different tax acts that they had passed. And so at each one, the colonists rose up and opposed them, and they would, at one point they even burned down Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house over the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was so horrid. And because the British colonists were already, they felt overtaxed. But here's the thing, they weren't opposed to taxes per se. They were opposed to Parliament could just tax them at will. And they had no representatives to speak for them in Parliament. They didn't have congressmen and senators for each one of their districts like we do today. They could just tax at will. And so they thought, well, we were defending the colonists, and so they can pay their fair share. Well, the colonists felt they were already paying their fair share with all of these other taxes. So in 1773, 3 ships were sailing towards America from London. They were the Eleanor, the Dartmouth, and the Beaver. I think every school child should know those 3 names, just like we know the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, or the Mayflower. Those 3 ships were so important. They were carrying tea from the British East India Tea Company. This is a replica of those chests. My husband made it for me. I was a sales rep for the Oliver Pluff Tea Company back in 2016, and I just resigned last year because I have so much to go on with the store. But this is a replica of the tea chest that they threw overboard at the Boston Tea Party. And he made this for me. And of course it shows backwards on here because I'm in selfie mode because I'm having to do this myself. But that is a U at the top. It looks like a V. It means United East India Company. UEIC in that heart. This was a tea chest. So anyway, Boston at the time was a fairly wild town. You've got rough working men. You've got hardworking men. You've got longshoremen, fishermen, rope makers, dock workers, all to do with port duties because Boston was a large port city. A lot of things came into Boston. A lot of imports came into Boston at that time. So these men were rough, and they were hardworking, and they were very strong. And so Boston actually had street gangs, and the 2 prominent street gangs were the North End gang and the South End gang. Well, Sam Adams actually rallied these 2 street gangs together and got them to support one cause, and that was this tea that's coming to the colonies from the British East India Tea Company, it's a monopoly on tea. And it's also carrying a tax, a new tax, a tea tax. And so they didn't want to pay this tea tax, and they didn't want to necessarily have to drink East India tea. There were other ships that came in with other tea companies, and they didn't want to be forced to drink East India tea because it was a monopoly, and they didn't want to pay the tax on it. So Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty, they organized some resistance to this. And so your top guys in the Sons of Liberty at that time were Sam Adams, he was in charge. John Hancock, who was very, very wealthy at the time, he was a merchant and a smuggler. He was smuggling tea. He didn't want East India tea here. It was competition to him. So you have John Hancock. He's funding the Sons of Liberty's things. Then you have Paul Revere. Paul Revere is their correspondent writer. He rides back and forth and delivers messages to the other Sons of Liberty. Then you have Dr. Joseph Warren, and Dr. Joseph Warren probably would have been a very, very prominent founding father had he lived, but unfortunately, he died in the Battle of Bunker Hill a few years later in Boston. But he was really good at writing, and he would write up pamphlets and literatures, and him and Sam Adams would write essays in the newspapers against these different taxes that the British was trying to impose upon America. And last but not least, you have William Molyneux, and he was born in Ireland, and he was the head of one of these street gangs. And he's kind of like what I would call the enforcer. So you've got these men, they are the core of the Sons of Liberty, and they are going to oppose this tea coming to Boston, 250 tons. So there was like over 340 chests of tea coming on these three ships. So when the tea comes, so we have a problem. So the tea is going to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, South Carolina. And so different ships are taking tea to these different places, but three of them are coming here. And so they don't want the tea to come. And when it gets here, they have 20 days, the ship captains have 20 days to unload their tea, or it gets confiscated by the British government and sold. So they don't want the tea to come off the ship at all. So, and it was very popular. This is why the British wanted to tax tea. Tea was drank in every American household, from the wealthy on down to the lower class. Every man, woman, and child drank tea. It was very popular in America. So it's like, well, hey, they drink a lot of tea, let's tax tea. So that's why they were taxing the tea. And the British East India Tea Company had a monopoly on tea. Now, Governor Thomas Hutchinson at the time, who was the royal governor of Massachusetts, he was appointed by the crown to be the governor. He was a corrupt man. And he was told to appoint tea agents. Now, these tea agents would sell the tea to merchants in town, and they would get a cut. So therefore, he would get a cut. So he appointed two of his own sons and one of his best friends to be tea agents. That's, absolutely nepotism. Your own sons and your best friend. So he wanted to make sure he was going to make money off of this tea. And so he appoints agents that will make him money. Also at this time going on, the colonists are kind of starting to unite, and they start committees of correspondence. And the committees of correspondence would write letters back and forth to each other. So Boston might be writing to Philadelphia, and Philadelphia might be writing to New York City, and then New York might be writing to Charleston, all of these big cities, and they would communicate with each other through these committees of correspondence. It was top secret. And Paul Revere would deliver the messages and the letters. So you had your committees of correspondence that were fighting against this. So anyway, we have with us today, I have 4 of the 5 teas that went overboard at the Boston Tea Party. We have Hyson. This is a green tea, and there were 15 chests of Hyson. So 15 chests of Hyson. There was Congu. Congu is just a really rich, good black tea. There were 15 chests of Congu. Put that up there. Then we have lapsang. There were 10 chests of lapsang. That, by the way, was Winston Churchill's favorite drink. Young Hyson was Thomas Jefferson's. And last, but definitely not least, is colonial boohee. Now, boohee in early America was the tea of choice. This was everyone's favorite tea. In fact, they just called all tea boohee. They would go into a coffee house or a tea house or whatever and just say, give me a cup of boohee. That's how much they drank this. I had never heard of boohee until I became a representative for Oliver Plough. And I opened up the can and sniffed it. Now, these are loose leaf teas, and it's smoky. And I was like, wow, that's different. I've never heard or seen or tasted a smoky tea. So I made a cup and I tasted it for the first time. Oh my goodness. I don't know how they threw this overboard, but it's delicious. And I will find, though, in my shop that if one person does not like boohee, it will usually be a woman. 9 out of 10 people love this, but the one that doesn't like it is usually a woman. I don't know why that is, but I love it. It's smoky. It's delicious. This is boohee. Guess how many chests of boohee went overboard at Boston that night? 240 chests of boohee. So you've got 15 and 15 and 10 and 240. And then there were 60 chests of Singlo. Now, Singlo is also a green tea. But, I mean, more of this than all the other teas combined, boohee. So, you can see on the label, Oliver Plough uses historic labels. There's the join or die snake. That's how important it was in early America. So, that's the teas that we have. And what's interesting to me is, you know, these men, this was very, very well organized. And they tried to use diplomacy at first to get this tea not to come on shore. They went and asked the tea agents to resign. They appealed to Governor Hutchinson. The answer was always no. This tea is going to land. It is going to come to port. It is going to get sold. And it wasn't the fact that there was a tax, the tax was high. It was actually very cheap tea. It was the principle of the fact that they're going to tax us at will, whenever they want, on whatever they want, however they want. And we're just not taking it anymore. And so they were standing up against the taxation without representation. They had nobody in Parliament to speak for them. And at that time, a very large mistake that the British government made was Americans thought of themselves as British subjects. They thought of themselves as freeborn Englishmen. But the British government didn't think of them that. They thought of them as colonials. It was almost like a slang word. Oh, you're just colonials. You know, you're just backwater frontiersmen. You're not at the same level as our regular British subjects. You're down here. And that snubbing of American citizens was a big, big mistake. It would come back to bite them, of course, we know later. But they wanted to have representation in Parliament, and they did not have it. So they tried diplomacy. So they had 2 months from the time they started meeting before these ships landed, because it took about 8 weeks for the ships to get from London to the ports. I brought with me today, this is a replica of the Essex Journal and Merrimack Packet. It is the Massachusetts and New Hampshire General Advertiser. The date of it is December 4th, 1773 in this newspaper. There is all sorts of stuff in here about the tea. So down at the bottom, I will read this. This is December 4th. We know that the Tea Party happened on the 16th. Friends, brethren, fathers, that worst of plagues, the detestable tea, shipped for this port by the East India Company, is now arrived in this harbor. The hour of destruction or manly opposition to the machinations of tyranny stares you in the face. Every friend to his country, to himself, and posterity is now called upon to meet at Faneuil Hall at 9 o'clock this day, at which time the bells will ring. to make a united and successful resistance to this last, worst, and most destructive measure of administration. So they put an advertisement in the Massachusetts newspaper to protest this tea. Now, Governor Hutchinson knew that these 5 men were responsible for a lot of other protests that were going on in Boston, like with the Stamp Act and whatever. And he had no love for these men whatsoever. He wanted to. This was tantamount to treason. He wanted them arrested and hung. And so they had to be very, very careful and plan very strategically about this tea. So they tried the diplomacy thing, and that didn't work. And they could not let this tea land onto the docks. So they came up with another plan. But here's the thing. John Hancock and Sam Adams had to be seen in public on that night somewhere else where there's lots of witnesses to say, well, they weren't there at the docks. They were, so they conjured up this meeting. Dr. Warren wrote a pamphlet and invited everyone to the town hall to meet. And Sam Adams and John Hancock spoke. Now, while that's going on, so there's all these witnesses that can say, well, John Hancock and Sam Adams was at this meeting. At that time, then, the Sons of Liberty were gathering together at Paul Revere's silversmith shop. They were disguising themselves as Mohawk Indians, and so that nobody would know who they were. So they're like putting, war paint on their face and putting feathers, and so people couldn't point their finger and go, I know who that guy is. I mean, they were totally unrecognizable. What's amazing to me is to this day, no one knows who those men were that aborted those ships and dumped that tea. It was that secret, and it stayed that secret. They took it to their graves. They know that maybe Paul Revere was involved, but other than him, no one knows the names of the men who participated in that party. So at midnight on December 16th, they take their lanterns, and this is actually called a Rever Lantern. Isn't it cute? They took their lanterns and hatchets, and they peacefully boarded these ships. And they demanded the keys of the holds from the captains, who gave them over to them because, what are you going to do when a whole mob of men come on your ship with hatchets? I would give over the keys too. And they took the tea chest, these tea chests, hacked them open with their hatchets, dumped the tea overboard. They were very methodical. They were very organized. They were very quiet. They just dumped tea. When it was all over with, they gave the keys back to the captains, and they swept the decks. They even cleaned up their mess. They didn't damage the ship in any way. All they did was get rid of the tea. Now, this is called one of the first acts of a really good example of civil disobedience in the colonies. And the riots that happened in America a few years ago, where stores were being looted and all this kind of stuff, they were saying, oh, it's like the Boston Tea Party. That's what they did. No, it was not like the Boston Tea Party. This was orderly. This was methodical. This was done with purpose and intent. And the only thing that was destroyed was the tea itself. They didn't ruin the captain's ships. They didn't set fire to the captain's ships. So this was an organized civil disobedience, and it was very successful. So all of the tea went into the harbor before the 20-day deadline, and Governor Hutchinson and the British were furious. This was over $1 million worth of tea. So what they did was they thought, we're going to starve out Boston. We're going to make them pay for this tea. They wanted them to pay literally and figuratively. So Thomas Hutchinson, they established the Port Act, and that closed the port of Boston. Well, when you close the port of Boston, nothing could get in, no food, no anything. And so they were going to starve the people into submission. What was wonderful was these committees of correspondence that I told you about earlier. They're sending out letters for help to the other colonies. And the other colonies take notice of what happened in Boston. Now, the other cities didn't let the tea come in either. But like Charleston did, for example, they locked it up in a warehouse and just let it mold. And nobody could get to it. And so that was how they took care of their tea. But the other colonies were like in Virginia and, New York and Pennsylvania. If the British government can do this to Boston, they can do it to us. And it literally united the colonies under one cause. And this is the beginning of a united America. Colonists were not thinking of themselves as, I'm a Virginian, I'm a Pennsylvanian, I'm a Massachusetts man. They were thinking of themselves as Americans, and they were uniting together. So Governor Hutchinson gets recalled to London. He's going to have to stand before the king and give an account of why this happened on his watch. In his place, they send General Gage. General Gage is a military man. He fought in the French and Indian War. He's very familiar with America. And he starts martial law. He imposes martial law on Boston. Everything is shut down. Ships come with many, many English soldiers. Abigail Adams lived in Braintree, Massachusetts, a very rural little town. That was John's wife. And she was up on a hillside, and she could look down and see Boston Harbor. And she looked, and all of these ships are coming into port. And she said it was as if all of England was afloat. It was terrifying. And so they bring in all of these British soldiers to impose martial law on these rebel-rousing patriots. So also, British soldiers could be quartered in your home. You had to take them in, or they could kick you out of your home and take over your home. A lot of generals did that, a lot of the top brass. Well, I'm just going to take this house. This is a nice house, and you're out on the street. So they were having to quarter British soldiers in their homes. Then they weren't given fair trial by jury in their own home state. If you committed a crime, you were shipped off to England for trial. So they lost that right. So they were losing all of their rights, and they're sending out these appeals through the committees of correspondence to the other colonies. And thankfully, the other colonies responded and was sending food and help and aid. But the most important thing that came out of this was the colonies said, we need to have a Continental Congress to discuss this. So the impact of the Boston Tea Party caused the formation of our first Continental Congress. And we all know what happened there. By 1776, that Continental Congress is declaring independence with the Declaration of Independence. So in 3 years. So the Boston Tea Party literally did spark the American Revolution. And I think that this is such an important event. And like I said, it's the 250th anniversary. And I always loved reading about this. I liked to watch the Disney movie Johnny Tremaine. If you've never seen it, I suggest you watch it. Even though it's a kid's movie, it's an excellent movie. It was probably made back in the early 70s, maybe late 60s, but it's called Johnny Tremaine, and it's about the Sons of Liberty and the Boston Tea Party and the battles of Lexington and Concord. And so it's just a really, really good movie to watch. Also, I would suggest that it just came out this week, and I guess it's probably for the anniversary, but on Fox Nation, I don't know if you all get that, but on Fox Nation, Rob Lowe has a 4-part miniseries about the Boston Tea Party, and oh my gosh, is it very well done. So I would suggest that you all watch these things, study about the Tea Party. It wasn't just all thought up in a day and they all boarded the ship as Indians and just threw the tea. It was very carefully planned and thought out and implemented, and it literally sparked the American Revolutionary War. We would not be where we were today if it wasn't for these brave men and women that did this. Now, I don't think there were women involved, but I'm sure women knew that what was going on, and they kept it a secret too. I'm sure they saw their husbands putting paint on their face. It's like, where are you going tonight, honey? But anyway, and I did this in my little cage bar because these men would meet at their favorite local tavern. And at that time in Boston, it was called the Green Dragon. And they would meet at the Green Dragon. I mean, and all up and down the colonies, men were meeting in taverns and having these discussions with the Committee of Correspondence. And so they were very important places of planning. So I did it tonight in my cage bar in honor of those guys. I've got my little Rever Lantern. A word about this. This is all pierced tin, and these were mostly used to go to the barn because it's not got any glass. It's very fire safe. You go to the barn, you need to milk the cow, you hang this on the hook, you open the door, and there's less chance of a fire. I'm sure they probably carry these on board the ship too, because you don't want to catch the ships on fire. And when the lights are off in the room, all these little piercings throw out such beautiful patterns on the wall. But this is literally called a Rever Lantern, and that's I think that's very cool. And then whenever you all order those bandbox kits that I make, I always include this newspaper as your lining. I don't know if any of you all have ever read it, taken the time to read it before you cut it up, but this is all about the Boston Tea Party. So I hope you enjoyed my little historical talk tonight about the Boston Tea Party. December 16th, 1773. It's December 16th, 2023. 250 years later, we're still talking about it. So I just want to thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this little history lesson. Night-night. Oh, this thing never works.